Hello. So we are going to be looking at today at a very different scale of analysis, and we are moving from larger, broader structures into, in some ways, everyday interactions. So we are going from the macro to the micro, right? And here, the broader question in symbolic interactionism, the subject that we are going to be speaking about today, is the constitution of the self, but the constitution of the self in relation to others and to other social relations. This is a school of sociology that takes shape in the United States in around from 1920s to 1950s and so on, and there are several different scholars who shaped it. Some of the ones that I'm going to be speaking about today are Herbert Mead, Charles Cooley, Herbert Blumer, and Erving Goffman. And especially towards the end, the key text that I am referencing is The Presentation of Everyday Life by Erving Goffman. Now, symbolic interactionism is largely situated in the domain of thinking of what is referred to as pragmatism. Pragmatism was a way of thinking or an approach to knowledge that also is taking root in the United States, where the argument is that broader questions of philosophy or metaphysics also need to have practical relevance, such that they need to guide action, they need to be able to understand social relations and interactions, and so on. And there are several people associated with pragmatism. For example, George Mead over here, who was also a close friend and collaborator with John Dewey, who's done immense amount of work in the fields of philosophy, education, and language. These are the people who are associated with it. Prior to George Mead writing, I'm going to speak briefly about Charles Cooley's work, who gave us the mirror analogy in terms of how we view ourselves as subjects and as objects, and I'll speak about this in I think my next slide. Now, Herbert Mead gave extensive and very popular lectures elaborating on his understanding or his conceptualization of what it means to understand the self and how the self engages with the other, and through that how social or sociology emerges, right? So, but he never quite produced a book. His lectures and his notes and all were compiled later on after he passes away, and by his students, I think one of them being Herbert Blumer, and who then further both elaborated upon these ideas and then gave it a name, which is what the title of today's lecture is, Symbolic Interactionism. Erving Goffman further, gave the details of symbolic interactionism, although he didn't quite word, but he's in the same lineage, and he likens these kind of interactions to performance. And performance here, as you will see, is very different from the notion of performativity that we spoke about when we speak about Butler. But largely what is important to understand here is that according to symbolic interactionism or these thinkers, the micro level is important, face-to-face interactions are important, one needs to go deep into grounded analysis. Erving Goffman did a very detailed ethnography of areas in Scotland, and then through those face-to-face interactions and understanding how people relate to themselves and to the others, he basically theorized his findings. So those are the central tenets of symbolic interactionism. The looking glass self. This is the term given by Charles Cooley, and I'm going to read out a little bit here. I think it's quite self-explanatory. He writes, "As we see our face, figure and dress in the glass and are interested in them because they are ours, and pleased or otherwise with them according as they do or do not answer to what we should like them to be. So in imagination we perceive in another's mind some thought of our appearance, manners, aims, deeds, character, friends, and so on, and are variously affected by it. A self idea of this sort seems to have three principal elements. 1. The imagination of our appearance to the other person. So, even as we are looking at the mirror, we are in our mind engaging with another person, right? How would my mother think that I'm looking, or what would my friends think of me? How would I appear to my office mates, and so on. So, all of that social interaction is actually going on inside our heads. The imagination of our appearance to the other person, the imagination of his or her judgment of that appearance, what would they think of me, and some sort of self-feeling such as pride or mortification, like whether if I think that I'm looking appropriate for the particular occasion, then I could feel happy, and if I feel that my appearance is inappropriate for the social interaction that I'm imagining in my head, then I might feel mortified. The thing that moves us to pride or shame is not the mere mechanical reflection of ourselves, but an imputed sentiment, the imagined effect of this reflection upon another's mind. This is evident from the fact that the character and weight of that other, in whose mind we see ourselves, makes all the difference with our self-feeling. We are ashamed to seem evasive in the presence of a straightforward man, cowardly in the presence of a brave one, gross in the eyes of a refined one, and so on. We always imagine, and in imagining, share the judgment of the other mind. So I think you're already getting a sense of how the self here is being socially constituted, right? The idea of the self is always in relation to, in conversation with the other. This is further elaborated by Mead, where he argues that the essence of the self is cognitive, and he writes, the I reacts to the self which arises through the taking of the attitudes of others. Through taking those attitudes, we have introduced the me, and we react to it as an I. So, I is me who is looking, is the subject, and me is that whom either in the mirror or in the eyes of another person, I am seeing myself, I am seeing me, the object of what I am viewing. I see me as an object through how others see me, as indicated by their attitudes towards me, or my perception of their attitudes towards me. The I is the response of the organism to the attitudes of others. So you see how the I here is constituted through an engagement with, through a perceived interaction with the other. And in this way, we are constantly having a conversation inside our minds of gestures and through gestures. This is also from Mead. He writes, self-consciousness lies in the internalized conversation of gestures which constitutes thinking. I mean, we are always in our mind thinking about how I would engage, how the other would perceive, what I would say, what they would say, and all of that. I think you get the point here. The origin and foundations of the self, like those of thinking, are social. All of this that is going on inside a mind, which might think as very personal, as very intimate, is actually social. That's one of the major points of symbolic interactionism. I'll read that line again. The origin and foundations of the self, like those of thinking, are social. In the conversation of gestures, what we say or signal, like whatever we are, I'm making hand gestures here, I'm making some facial gestures in the images over there. These gestures are kind of like a language. They appear as symbols, right? Or signals. So, in the conversation of gestures, what we say or signal calls out a certain response in another, and that in turn changes our own action. So, there is a back and forth. So that we shift from what we started to do because of the reply or signal the other makes. The conversation of gestures is the beginning of communication. In fact, Goffman's work, again drawing from Mead and the others, is quite central to an understanding of communication. as it's quite apparent. Now, Bloomer elaborated on and gave the title Symbolic Interactionism. And for him, the central points of symbolic interactionism are these. He writes, human beings act towards things on the basis of the meaning that the things have for them. So, meaning and action are interacting here. The meaning of such things is derived from or arises out of the social interaction that one has with one's fellows. So, I might assign a meaning of that this is dangerous territory based on maybe the look that my friend gave me when I discussed that particular context, right. So, the meaning that that place or that situation has for me is derived out of a social interaction, and that meaning is forming the basis of my next action. These meanings are handled in and modified through an interpretive process used by the person in dealing with the things he encounters. So, there is interaction going on here. Obviously, that is why symbolic interactionism. Now, also the point that I find most valuable for our study as sociologists. Bloomer writes, the life and action of people necessarily change in line with the changes taking place in their world of objects. Now, here objects, Bloomer means both people and things, social situations. So, as historical, geographical, social context changes, so too the meanings we assign to those things, and therefore so too our actions and behavior. I have put up here images of an office space, right, and in that sense, how has that changed over the centuries based on how we worked, what kind of tools we worked with, whether it was a typewriter, it was a desktop computer, or it was in cubicles, how we, while working, what kind of office space there was in terms of what kinds of engagement or interactions were possible. Like it appears, if it could be that in a cubicle, it is in an unspoken way taboo to keep getting up and going to the other person's cubicle, because that would mean that you are wasting time and not quite producing the work that you are assigned to do. Whereas when you are working across the same table, then as you are working, interaction is maybe not that taboo. I mean, this is just an example that I am trying to give, but I think you are understanding. Now, we also assume different kinds of roles or different kinds of cells based on different contexts and the person that we are interacting with. So, the same me is right now a professor giving a talk in front of this camera to you, but then at home I might be very different, with my children I might be very different, with my partner I might be very different, in a classroom I might behave very differently. And in order to elaborate that, I have put up these images from the movie English Winglish, because I think it very nicely captures how the actor Sridevi here goes from India, being a mother and a wife, and what she later learns in terms of the term entrepreneur, where she makes these laddus, to the United States. Her own notion of herself changes in that shift in geographical and social context, right? How she views herself, you can see that in the body language. And then when moments come where Goffman has also written about such moments, which are, he elaborates on embarrassing moments where the norms of that we understood as defining our behavior or our action shift. So, she is standing in line for a Subway sandwich, and the engagement that she is used to with the person across the counter is very different in that particular context, and she fumbles and the sandwich falls down, right. So, there is that sense of all of us constantly judging how one is supposed to act in a particular scenario and then adjusting our action accordingly. Here you see where she is with her child, and her body language changing in the poster that I have over there. So, Goffman looks at ritual not so much in the Weberian sense, but he looks at ritual more in terms of interaction. And he writes, in fact, I'm quoting this from Michel Dillon's textbook, Introduction to Sociological Theory, which I think is an excellent introduction to several other theories that we have been talking about in this class. So, she writes, for Goffman, ritual refers to all those simplified, exaggerated, stereotyped behaviors that signal or display particular emotions or social statuses in various interaction situations. We can all picture, and I think Bollywood or any film or drama is a very good space to observe that, where you would imagine a mother to behave in a certain way towards her child. You would imagine a father to behave in a particular way towards their child. You would imagine the interaction between a boss and an employee to happen in a particular way, right? So, these are rituals that we have imbibed. These are rituals that constitute ourselves, but they are so taken for granted that for the most part, we are not paying much attention to how we are acting very differently, let's say when we are in front of our parents, because that's how that particular ritual or that particular relationship is defined, than when we are with our friends. Goffman then likens all of this to theatre. For him, I think he takes quite seriously these sentences from Shakespeare's As You Like It that I've quoted up here to argue for social interaction as from a dramaturgical perspective, drawing from drama and theatre. So he writes, Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. I think my example from English Winglish shows that plays many parts quite well, where the same actor or the same person is seen as somewhat submissive housewife and mother who doesn't quite articulate her own emotions and views, but gives precedence to her children and her household, and then eventually in a different context learns to also articulate her own perspective and stand up for her own self. And also as she engages with friends, the kind of liberty she finds in a different social setting is quite apparent in the film. Goffman also talks about impression management, and to do that, he, again drawing from drama, he gives the metaphor of front stage and backstage. So front stage is where we are quite usually attuned to what the norms are, what the expectations are of that particular setting and that particular social relationship, and then act accordingly. So it is a performance. It is a performance we put up. It's an appearance that we put up. Whereas backstage is that space which is more private and more intimate, and therefore we might be able to relax and loosen some of those appearances that we have in the front stage. To give an example here, I've put up the image of a formal dinner where we all act in a certain way. We in fact create a certain impression management, and to do that, he also writes about, for example, people team up to do that. For such as a family who's hosting a dinner might give the appearance of a very happy family and a happy host, whereas in the backstage they might have just quarreled or argued over something. So there is an impression management in social settings. Goffman writes, one of the most interesting times to observe impression management is the moment when a performer leaves the back region and enters the place where the audience is to be found, or when he returns therefrom. For at these moments, one can detect a wonderful putting on and taking off the character. The moment you leave the formal dining and now I am done, you can actually, the whole image of your body of actually first having to be formal and then relaxing and just letting go happen. So that moment of transition is when one can become conscious, or the sociologist can become aware of what was a more put on appearance and what is a more intimate nature of the self. For some professions, he says, the difference between front stage and backstage somewhat vanishes. Somebody who's a popular media person, somebody who's a politician, they are usually always having to put on an appearance, even when they are in their private lives, the kind of holidays they go to, the kind of leisure time that they have, the kind of activities that they engage in, even when they are not performing work, are under a certain view, and therefore the lines between front stage and backstage for them are sometimes blurred. But in those situations, impression management, and many of them hire firms to create a certain public persona, it's still managed in the sense that it is through their own volition, through their own willingness. However, in some cases that is not the case, and I'll kind of come to those cases later. Let me go back to some of the themes that also he raises. He raises the themes of deference, of stigma, of passing. Social situations also come with hierarchies, and we, through observation, through this symbolic interactionism, we are always taking cues of those hierarchies and then behaving in those particular ways. So, for example, gendered hierarchies, caste hierarchies, race hierarchies become apparent through these bodily gestures of deference. For deference, Goffman writes, a classic stereotype of deference is that of lowering oneself physically in some form or other of prostration. And I found that line quite interesting because it appears from this that this lowering oneself is almost cross-cultural, because the image I have up here is from Kashmiri artwork, and what he's writing is from a United States perspective, and both are showing this lowering down, right? Although it's also important to mention that Goffman has been critiqued for, and many of the other symbolic interactionists, for kind of assuming a universalized social milieu, where taking the idea that there are norms and then people follow the norms, but then what happens when those norms are not built on a shared understanding of, let's say, minorities. The example I gave from English to English, there were norms, but she went to a different context, and so she had to adjust her norms, and she didn't quite fit into the majority, right? Norms, if we look at Butler's argument, are also spaces where we can challenge, right? We can abrupt and we can kind of make a break when we challenge these norms. But that having said, let me come back to deference here. So correspondingly, holding the body erect and head high is stereotypically a mark of unashamedness, superiority and disdain. And this is something that you can observe, especially in particular cultures. If you notice the gendered hierarchies, right, you would notice how men are kind of usually, especially upper caste men, sit in a particular posture, whereas many times you might find women who might not be as powerful, usually with their heads down or walking with their heads down, right? Similarly, caste, or if you notice inside households, especially in the Indian context, it is oftentimes the house help, the housemaid usually would come and sit on the floor even as everybody else is sitting on the dining table. These are all moments where a certain social hierarchy is getting solidified, but it is also creating a certain notion of the self, a certain understanding of the self within that social hierarchy. Now, Goffman also speaks about stigmas, such as certain ways of being or certain racialized or based on national origin or body ability, are certain ways of being are stigmatized, and therefore people who consider themselves or who are in that category of stigmatized as per the norm would try to articulate or try to act in ways such that they can pass off as the normal, right? So he calls that passing, where you're constantly trying to pass off as somebody who fits quite in. And he gives the example of skin color also, and this we have also seen in a context where women and now also men would put Fair and Lovely to appear more lighter skinned and therefore reach whatever is the hierarchy in the normative expectation of skin color. For impression management, Goffman further writes that there is the obligation to convey certain information and not to convey other impressions because those other impressions might be stigmatized, just as others present must too. When individuals come into one another's immediate presence in circumstances where no spoken communication is called for, so it's not just spoken, it is also you kind of read, you get a sense through facial expressions, through body language, through the setting. When individuals come into one another's immediate presence in circumstances where no spoken communication is called for, they nonetheless inevitably engage one another in communication of a sort. Through bodily appearance, dress, bearing, movement and position, sound level, physical gestures such as waving or saluting, facial decorations and broad emotional expression. Although he's calling here broad emotional expression, but Arlie Hochschild, for example, has critiqued Goffman's work even as she draws upon his work to argue that he is not paying enough attention to the inner worlds, to the actual emotions that a person might be feeling even as they are putting on a particular appearance. In every society, these communication possibilities are institutionalized. Half aware that a certain aspect of his activity is available for all present to perceive, the individual tends to modify his activity, employing it with its public character in mind. A body symbolism, an idiom of individual appearance and gestures that tends to call forth in the actor what it calls forth in the others, immediately present. Now, this is what I was talking about when I was saying that for certain categories of people, front stage and backstage kind of intermingle, the boundaries are blurred. And I gave the example of politicians and very well-known media figures for whom that happens, but then for whom it is a conscious choice. Well, there are others that Goffman writes about for whom it is no choice. For them, every behavior of theirs, even that which is supposed to be part of the private, more intimate realm, are monitored, are surveilled, and therefore it is always front stage. He calls these institutions total institutions, and he gives the examples of strict boarding schools, mental asylums, hospitals, prisons, and so on. Now, the methodology of research for symbolic interactionism, something that goes very well with it, one is ethnography and one is grounded theory. Bloomer elaborates on this. The metaphor that I like is that of lifting the veils that obscure or hide what is going on. The task of scientific study is to lift the veils that cover the area of group life that one proposes to study. The veils are lifted by getting close to the area and by digging deep into it through careful study. Symbolic interactionism is a down-to-earth approach to the scientific study of group life and human conduct. Its empirical world is the natural world of such group life and conduct. So, by paying attention to very micro scale, like one individual's engagement, interaction, facial expressions, hand gestures, bodily composure, all of that, one is getting a sense of what that group life might be. So, it requires very close, face-to-face engagement with one's research site context. Now, this is my last slide, and I want to go back to Bruno Latour, whom we spoke about in my previous lectures, and he also writes about Erving Goffman, and so I will just read it out and then leave you there with whatever thought processes it brings to you in terms of looking at and understanding both these ways of understanding the social. So, Latour writes, as soon as the play starts, as Erving Goffman has so often showed, nothing is certain. Is this for real? Is it fake? Does the audience's reaction count? What about the lighting? What is the backstage crew doing? Is the playwright's message faithfully transported or hopelessly bungled? Is the character carried over? And if so, by what? What are the partners doing? Where is the prompter? If we accept to unfold the metaphor, the very word actor directs our attention to a complete dislocation of action, warning us that it is not a coherent, controlled, well-rounded and clean-edged affair. By definition, action is dislocated. So think about these ideas, think about our everyday life as a performance, think about the notion of how both Goffman and Latour are using the term actor, and think about how theorists of grand processes such as capitalism and patriarchy and bureaucracy have theorized the social world, and how theorists of the micro such as symbolic interactionism, Arlie Hochschild's emotional studies have engaged with the social world. So I leave you with these thoughts. Thank you so much.